Hello everyone, welcome to the week 4 and 5 lecture. Um, this is, you can see it as a lecture or you can see it as a resource supporting you in your reflections about the concept of principle. I know that we often talk about principle, but I think that we need to actually systematize those thoughts and experiences we have collected throughout our various degrees and traditions of thinking. So let us get on with it. So first of all, some of my students, especially those in EPL 501, have learned a lot, Christensen, about Professor Clayton Christensen from the Harvard Business School. So this PowerPoint contains a number of YouTube references. You will see here this 39, 51. These are actually links that you can actually copy. If they don't open simply when you click on them as you run the PowerPoint, they will, you can actually copy them and paste them directly into YouTube, and they will take you directly to the place on the timeline where Professor Clayton Christensen actually talks about those interesting perspective on what strategy is. Here, I've discussed this in video 1 for this week, and also on the concept what is the job that needs to be done. That's a very interesting concept that Professor Clayton has actually come up with. Um, I have actually written in my own publications about it and also the people that were mentoring me. But it's always very interesting when someone from a different discipline says things which are controversial in a sense in our own field, and um, and yet were developed independently of the people, for example, that I work with, and from a different perspective, and yet amazingly we are on the same page. I will come back to this issue of, or to this concept of the job to be done, but here are some links so you may actually enjoy watching them. If not now, if you don't see them now as relevant, one day maybe. Okay, now this lecture is actually an outcome of an earlier lecture I had with my students from the EPL 501. If you are EPL 508 or 509 student, you might be actually wondering what's in it for you. Well, as I said, it's just a resource, an exercise in thinking. Okay, so there are particular concepts in education that are fundamental to education. It really doesn't matter whether you talk about professional development or whether you talk about learning languages or whether you talk about management, right? We always talk about one and the same thing, which is, right? It is very interesting, which is what? Well, there's only one thing that actually underpins all our learning, and it's not necessarily the concept of interaction, but interaction summarize it, it's synonymous to it. We could think of it as a concept of meaning management. And that's very important. Why is it important? Because if you are a principal in a school and you want a change to happen, or a process to support progress to be put in place, what is it that you deal with? You don't deal with processes, you don't deal with objects. What you deal is with people and how they actually understand the direction or of progress or the things you would like to actually happen in the school, right? So everything we do in life, we could boil down to the concept of meaning management. And I do not want at this very moment to link it with biology or to link it with physics. But let me say that for the purpose of any units you do in education, it is most likely that until you solve the problem of what meaning management actually is, or in other words, what interaction is, it's gonna be very hard to handle a lot of information in the literature and work with it in the way that will actually help you in building community relationships, building positive relationships among the staff in your school, building a positive relationship between students and teachers. You see what I'm saying? All of this is about the principle of meaning management. And it's not easy. All of us in our daily life know that you say one thing and people come out from the meeting with you and they understood things not exactly the way you meant it. So what actually did happen? We could ask ourselves. So we had this discussion in my on-campus classes that I taught in EPL 541, and as students who also do other units, for example, and do some reading for the purpose of assignments in those units, they actually came up with very interesting readings that talked about interaction in an ESL context, or in a ESL context, which is a context where actually students are expected to learn English as a second language. So students in our on-campus class came up with different ways of teaching interaction, making interaction this and that. However, when I ask our students to actually tell me how the author of the article defined interaction, well, he didn't. Well, that's very interesting. And now this is one very interesting strategy. When you read articles and people talk about learning, or people talk about interaction, or people talk about success, right? Do not feel in any way um, embarrassed if you feel that these concepts were not explained in the paper. Because if they were not, it's a bad paper. Because at the end of the day, if someone tells me how well they actually can support interaction, but they can't define what that process is, I'm not quite sure what is it that they are talking about. So I asked my students a week ago, and to be sure they forgot it by now. So we had to actually redo it in a second week. Who is actually talking? What is interaction? Is it really truly two people talking? Is meaning as simple as coding information and the recipient of this information is decoding? Is meaning about a code? Is it that simple? Is meaning literal? Why is it that people understand things differently? So now, this is not a lecture on interaction, this is a lecture on working with principles. So I will direct you to some readings towards the as I go through this class, but through this video. But what I want you to do is consider the following. The way I define, and you may actually define it differently, but if you talk about interaction or people working together, it will be very helpful if you defined it. And also, what I will be teaching you here through this class is that once you define it, this is not to stay on page 2, paragraph 3. This particular definition has to underpin everything else you say in your assignment, right? So a principle is a way of understanding a particular process that once you actually commit to it, that's it, you're locked in. until you actually get yourself into a project that you want to actually explore it from different perspective and see how whether it holds water or not. If it is not your objective, then you actually have to do what some people say, identify the framework or the conceptual or intellectual framework in which your assignment is embedded. And my own thinking is embedded in the principle that we actually do not talk to one another. I know it sounds like a heresy, and it may well be, but I can provide you, but won't today, because this is not my objective. I can provide you with evidence, whether it's neuroscience or physics or semiotics, which basically says that we're actually stuck in our own heads. And what I call interaction is interlocutors acting on their own frames of reference, right? And I will show you throughout this podcast how empowering it is to actually not only define your intellectual framework, but then be consistent in working with it. And this principle here I have actually unraveled in two different ways here. Basically what I'm saying here, that when a person talks to you, or what appears that a person is talking to you, you actually cannot know what they are saying. You can, on the basis of your own history, you can make approximations or best guesses of what they say, of the impact of what they say, of how what they say actually impacts on the purpose of your interaction together, of what is it that you're working with. So this is a complicated explanation. I'll just make it very simple. The most you can do is actually, on the basis of your own history, guess what the other person is saying. You really never sit in someone else's head. And that's very important, because when we think that we obviously we understood what this other person said, I mean, we were there. Well, where were you really? In that person's head, in their experiences, in the frames of references that they called for when they were actually interacting with you? No. We always act on what we understand. But this is not just the case with the adults. It's the same with children. They cannot process information on the terms that we ascribe to them. They process information on the terms that are their own. Well, that makes life really difficult when it comes to education. Because unfortunately, the frame of reference which I am now suggesting to you as a working model in which I am, and I challenge you to either use it or to produce a counter model. So what it does say to education, that you might actually keep explaining to children things, but as you do so, you do that answering the questions that you think the children are asking, not exactly the questions that children are actually experiencing. Just like I now produce this YouTube on the basis of my own guesses of what might be helpful to you, and also on the by in reference to my own the questions that I'm posing in my head about what could be helpful, right? They're not your questions. So I can only hope that this video will have some impact on your writing and professional life, and how and where it will take you, I cannot know. So To summarize, the intellectual framework in which I work positions a human being in relation to their own history. While this history is social, the person's trajectory is individual. Two people can live under the same roof, go to the same school, eat the same things daily, and they can actually draw on different experiences as they are acting in the world. So interlocutors act on their own frames of reference. In a sense, we could draw two heads never actually meeting one another as they are interacting. So the idea of sharing frames of reference is getting a little bit more fuzzy. But I am just leaving there because my point today is to show you how powerful not only this principle is, but how powerful it is to have a principle and then draw on it all the time. All the time. And if your principle on which you draw is not about meaning management but some other one, then you have to actually check its power, because when you actually want to work with concepts or with issues, and if you cannot actually draw on that principle, then the principle is not fundamental enough. You have to look somewhere else. Let us have a look at what I mean. So you still have the same text here, and I take photos with, we all have iPhones here. So this is the photo of the whiteboard, not really relevant that much, but I will just tell you what students said in classes. I was actually suggesting these ideas. So you can always act on your own frames of reference. That's what the first sentence says, although it's not very visible to you. Now, what people said, of course, these interactions are always purposeful, right? But those purposes are drawn from our history. They're not floating in the air. They're not neutral. They actually are highly personal. They are our own, the way we see. We give our action purpose. Our actions are not purposeful, we give them purpose. Now, this idea about ambiguity, we interact in order to reduce ambiguity. That's what this is not this is just a way I see it, and this idea is not new. It was suggested probably many times throughout the history, but I have traced references to 1930s. But so it's not Ania Lian, it's not new. None of it that I'm saying to you is Ania Lian. I'm just not necessarily at this very moment pointing all the reference, but yes. So to reduce ambiguity. So when you see someone on the street and you say, "Hi, Peter," why are you saying that? Because you don't want Peter to think that you're rude. You have just reduced the ambiguity, right? You acted in order to, remember the in order to is that purpose, in order to reduce ambiguity. Peter, I'm a nice friend of yours. Hi, Peter. And that's it. And it was an interaction. Okay, so now we pretty much, and you felt it was driven by your understanding that it needs to happen. Didn't have to maybe, but it did because of your frames of reference. Okay, so we have the principle pretty much intact now. It's all cool. Let's move on now. Now, what I do in class with my EPL 501 students, but you can see it's useful to other units as well, because in the units where students actually do their own projects, will see this resource I'm just recording as useful, because I'm looking at different projects that students are doing actually, and I'm trying to actually link now to students' projects. So once we actually identified what interaction is, then we were also looking about what language learning is. And basically, language learning here, in this sense, if interaction is about acting on your own frames of reference, so if students are learning second language or first language, but let's say in a second language will make it more apparent, what we want students is to develop their own sense of history, their own frames of reference, right? They cannot borrow the frames of reference of a native speaker. They still have to reconstruct them and integrate them into their own thinking, into their own history. So ultimately, even when students learn a second language, they actually, what they do, they create their own frames of reference, right? So they learn, they create their own history using the frames of reference of context that happened in that second language. We'll leave it there. Now, why did we talk about ICT? Well, it's very important. First of all, I ask students in class whether CAL, what is CAL? CAL software. It is computer-assisted learning. In second language is computer-assisted language learning, but um, in general, people talk about computer-assisted learning, right? So what is ICT and what is CAL? So computer-assisted learning is any type of electronic technology that is used in order to support learning. Now, ICT, Internet communication technology, I find it a little bit more narrow. It's not using technology. It's not just about communication. Um, it's not about just networking, right? So to support learning, we don't just use technology in order to actually facilitate networking. There's more that can be done. And what can be done? Here I have given you a link to a paper by Professor Andrew Lian about what is called software. He talks about language learning software. We'll have a look whether that definition actually applies beyond language learning. This is my paper here on knowledge transfer. I produced it on request. I was invited, so I produced this paper. It was, I think, in the year 2000 or 2001. This particular organization exists, and here's the link. So I did that and I produced the paper. So there it is. So these papers basically invite you to reflecting on what actually technology, what what technology can do in the context of learning, right? So it actually expands you a little bit. Now, what my anticipation now, what would technology have to do? What will technology have to do in order to be consistent with the principle that interlocutors do not act on someone else's frames of reference but on their own? What do you think? You see, this is very interesting now. Because now it seems like, okay, well, we fixed this, what interaction is, and let it be what Ania says or some other experts in semiotics or communication say. But what does this have to do with learning, with technology that supports learning? Well, what will the job of supporting learning be if we remember that learning is about meaning management, right? Learning is about making meaning less meaningful. If learning is about not memorizing and regurgitating, it is about actually internalizing, reconstructing in a creative and critical way, then learning actually is about making meaning less meaningful. It is about meaning making. And the problem obviously is that students have their own frames of reference and there are expert frames of reference. And now how can we bridge those expert frames of reference with students, and how can technology step in? Well, let me suggest that the way the technology can be helpful is by creating opportunities for students to manage information better or differently, right? So technology is not about setting up, it's not only about setting up networks so that students can talk to one another and then miracles happen. What technology also can do is to create opportunities for students to start using the frames of reference differently and therefore represent the problem to themselves differently and call for different resources or forms of representation in their brain so that now new connections can be constructed, right? So the technology is not about presenting information and now students are expected to watch it 30 times and hopefully a miracle will happen. Interactivity is nothing else but constructing different pathways for students to work with information, to manage information. You see? So the principle that students can only act on their own frames of reference, now when taken into interaction or interactive learning, what we're now saying, interactive doesn't mean just by talking to one another. Can we now think of different ways of facilitating different ways for students to actually work with information, to manage it in more than one way? And here comes the technology, because technology is really good at it. Because the teacher in class, when the teacher in class deals with students, the teacher is limited. Technology can actually show things in a more imaginative way and also giving control to the student. So ultimately what happens in the best circumstances, that the ways students work with information is managed by the student, is driven by the questions they ask themselves. That's new. That's new in learning. Okay? So you see how the principle of acting on your own frames of reference now is very helpful when it comes to thinking about how technology comes into the context of teaching and also what interactive learning environment actually means. Now, one of our students is actually writing about what barriers teachers experience in the use of technology. Now, obviously, a lot of we can actually may work at ourselves, as teachers often don't know how to do it, why to do it, they have no access to technology and so on. So problems compile themselves. But my real question is, do you as a researcher know what the main barrier often is? Do you as a researcher can identify the main barrier? I mean, do you know what the barrier is? Do you know where the crux of the matter is? Do you know what to look for? Because if you say they don't know how, what does it mean? Oh, well, we just need to send them to workshops. They will see examples and they will use these 3 examples that they remembered forever and ever. And then they will see another 3 examples in the workshop, and hopefully they will remember another 2 out of that. So now they'll have 5. Well, that's not really cool. It's not very powerful, is it? They don't know why. Okay, you as a researcher, do you know what is it that they need to know in order for you to make the decision that they don't know why? Huh. Rewind this question if you want to understand it, right? Do you as a researcher know, you as a student doing this project, do you know what is it that they need to know for you to make a decision that they just don't know why to use technology? Do you know? Right? It's easy to point the finger at people and say, well, those teachers don't know. Teachers are scapegoat of everybody's, right? The government screams at them, the rednecks on current affairs scream at them. Right, but do you as a researcher know what is it that they need to know that is so good about technology? An interesting question, right? So it may not be all about access. In fact, we have a group of Cambodian students in our class, in our classes, in our courses, and actually I thought myself that maybe there will be a lot of problems with access, and they said to a degree only, Ania. There's a lot of people who have mobile devices and they could be using them. So what I'm saying now is that before we actually draw a conclusion about someone else's condition, we should actually reflect about this conclusion, right? So, and I know this is nothing new, but maybe it is new in the light of how I actually word it. So, for example, if I ask you here, do you yourself know what they need to know in order for you to say that they don't know why technology is useful? Now, okay, so we go back to interaction concept. And what is it that we find out? Well, now I'm repeating what I said before. Well, do they actually know this? That the most that anybody can do is only to act on what they understand. Right? So consequently, the use of technology would mean that can we enhance students' use of what they know through by enhancing the interactive conditions. Right, that could be good. But what does this mean? Okay, so we have a principle that telling us this is important. But I will show you another step here. So this is important and fundamental. This is fundamental. So this is what they need to know. What is the intellectual framework in which they sit? How do they portray people? How do they portray meaning management? What is the most foundational and fundamental principle in which they actually embed all their teaching practice? Do they think about meaning management? Making meaningful meaningless, what does that mean? They probably do. But it would be interesting now to take people there and find out whether they actually believe this or whether they believe they can do mind meld, which is the Star Trek thing. You know, we can actually read people's thoughts. But if we can't, then we really need to actually think about the concept of interactivity. Now, but there is another trick which is very, very interesting. So remember I was talking about Clayton Christensen, professor from Harvard. What he is saying is that he's saying pretty much the same as I'm saying, but now he's turning it around a bit, positioning it a bit differently. And look what he's saying. How do you know what to do? How do you know what to do? What is right? What is it that you need to know as a professional? And what he is saying in the business context, he says, understanding the customer is the wrong end of analysis. Now, isn't that a heresy? I mean, the whole field of education says you've got to understand the learner, you've got to understand the learner. But I just said to you, you can't understand the learner because the learners act on their own frames of reference. Now, this is really, the principle is now really what looked nice. Now it's getting disturbing. On top of it, this guy from business is saying the same thing. We could say he's from business, therefore he wouldn't know, but he is an academic, he is famous, and he is into making money. He is actually a consultant to businesses as well. And he's saying, don't look at the customer. What he says first, you've got to know the job. You've got to know the job that needs to be done. What is your job? Ah, my job is to enhance the interactivity of students' learning so that students can actually have enhanced so that students can actually have more ways of working with information, richer ways, richer pathways for working with information rather than just one way. I explain, you repeat, I explain, I demonstrate, you repeat, right? This is just based on teachers' own thinking. What we need to do is to bring in a bit more unpredictability, bring in ways that actually enable students to move through information. Well, what does that mean then? Right? So we have done a little bit of semiotics here. This is interdisciplinarity. Not only, we also have done sociology here, but I think sociology and semiotics, which is a study of meaning, are pretty close together. So now we actually went to business. And what's in here? Here it says everything we do is to solve an emotional problem, which fundamentally is a physiological problem. Now, what does that mean? Why am I putting it here? This comes from neuroscience. Now, neuroscience now has actually had a big leap forward. What happened now? They have now better technology for actually working for actually monitoring what happens in people's brains. And this is not to say that they are mind readers either. But what they have discovered is that the systems that you use in your brain to control your breathing, your well-being, your blood pressure, it amazingly are the same systems that actually are responsible for your emotions. Right? Well, that's very interesting, because when you think that emotional life has nothing to do with your physiological life, but you know it does have everything to do, because you get into fear, and what happens? You can't breathe. You stay longer in the fear, and you get either depressed or you die. Either way, it's no good for your physiology. So, but what they actually are saying, that whatever problem, everything we do is to solve an emotional problem. Everything we do, that means learning, right? So now we have Nick, I think, is doing emotional well-being. And Nick is looking at the whole thing thinking, Jesus, it's really linking, isn't it? So everything we do with learning is not actually a cognitive alone. Cognition has nothing to do just with pure reasoning with no emotion. This is all linked. In fact, it's the same, they say. So what I am saying is that if students can, the only thing that students can do is to act on their own frames of reference. If you facilitate this process, if you actually facilitate interactive learning, you are at the same time supporting students' emotional well-being and ultimately their physiological well-being. Wow, so what they are actually saying that we may not actually have a choice. You don't want kids to drop dead or to be depressed or anxious or lose their personal resilience. We need to actually support them rather than just require things from them, right? So you can see how this little principle about everything is about meaning management, and we can only manage meaning in our own frames of reference, in reference to our own frames of reference. Now it's linking now to the way in which we position our job as teachers. Our job as teachers is actually to increase interactivity because, as Clayton and I and Andrew Lian would say, because this supports students' achievement. When children are enabled to process information on their terms in relation to their own questions, they actually feel they are achieving as they are achieving. We support their emotional well-being, we support their physiological well-being, and we as teachers are not so much trying to work out the student, but we're trying to work out the problem, which is how can we create increasingly interactive conditions in our classroom. Right? Well, that's very interesting. So now the question about the barriers would be, do teachers position the use of technology in class as a tool actually that enables them to do what they see as their job, which is to increase interactivity for learning to happen? Or do they see it as a side thing, maybe, maybe not, because we can do it without technology. Sure, we can do some things without technology, but people who say we can do it completely without technology, they haven't actually explored what can technology do and what questions need to be asked in order to increase interactivity. Now, as you can see that I very often quote my own papers or my ex-husband's papers because he's a professor and I've written with him and by myself. Well, he is one. I've written with him The Secret of a Shaolin Monk. I mean, it's about the use of technology. It's on his website. Here's the link you could use. This paper is quite old, but it's good enough. We've got other papers, but this will do. This actually outlines, shows to you some imaginative ways in which a person can think about technology in, well, we're talking about second language learning, but you could actually then abstract it and think about learning altogether. Now, we have done 40 minutes of learning, and you can see how I have been going with this principle of meaning management, that learning is about meaning management and the role of the teachers to support students in having access to increasingly complex or interactive conditions so that their meaning management can be more enhanced, can be supported in more than one way, so that students can actually enter the learning uh, task from many different perspectives, through many different paths, as opposed to this is good for you. Okay, so they have control. So this principle has actually helped us to define the job of a teacher. It has helped us to actually understand why students need interactive conditions. Not only that, it actually has helped us to go into the idea of students' well-being and say, well, unless we actually support students in their in a way of learning that is actually on their terms, we actually are disrupting their physiological well-being, right? So there. What else have we done? I'll try to actually cover it very quickly here. So what is the purpose of education? Is to support students' achievement, but on students' terms. So there has to be some interaction here between students, how students actually perceive their achievement, and also how teachers or the government perceives achievement. So now I'll just take you to these points here. So I have taken this picture from our class because I just wanted, it's a terrible handwriting because I only type, but here it is. What is the purpose of education, right? What is achievement? So I said that students can only act on their frames of reference. So what is the job of education? Obviously, it's to expand those frames of reference. You narrow them, you reduce their opportunities to learn. So not only you actually have to increase interactivity, but the job of a teacher is actually to expand those frames of reference so that students are included in the world. Now, here's a challenge for you. Typically, we say we have to produce inclusive learning conditions, and what typically people mean by this, we have to take account of students' differences. Yes, but flip it now. We also have to take account of how diverse and rich the environment is, right? So the achievement is not just to be about students doing over and over the same thing. We need to challenge them, support as well, but we need to challenge them. We need to enable their exploration of the environment, of the complexity of their environment in which they live, so that they can feel included in that environment. Right? So how do you measure it? How do you measure it? Simple. The best test to measure students' achievement, or the best test to actually account for inclusivity of students in their environment, is one that actually targets the diversity of that environment. If you create tests that only target one equation, one thing, one aspect of life, one form of expression, one dance, one form of meaning, one way of being, you have then not only prevented students from showing their achievement, but you have narrowed the world. You've removed the world. The world is no longer rich and beautiful and a dance. It has become a what do they call it? Not just an abstraction, but a stick figure. You know, children don't draw Mona Lisa, they draw five limbs, you know, two hands, one body, and two legs, right? They're stick figures. So, to account for inclusion means to increase students' access to the diversity of this beautiful world in which we live, and to test for inclusion and to measure it is to basically make room in our tests for that diversity. You remove the diversity, you're no longer testing students, you're actually creating behavioristic conditions of act of stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response, and nobody actually knows what they are teaching and nobody knows what they are testing. Nothing is inclusive because students are removed from the world and they are basically put in a cage of something that nobody understands because nobody makes a meaning out of a narrow context. Because in order to make a meaning out of anything which appears to be narrow, is we do it in reference to the richness we have. Because if we only understood one thing, we wouldn't have understood anything, right? It's like little babies can't tell the difference between mommy and another woman well, just metaphorically speaking, because if you only see one thing, you can't understand one thing unless you understood it in more than one way, in reference to other things. So now we are very clear about the purpose of this little podcast. Now, I want you to be very, very clear. This was not entertainment about thinking intellectual. This was not exercise in thinking intellectually or showing you my views. What I wanted you to see now, how a simple idea of everything being about meaning management and explaining the concept of meaning management as acting on your own frames of reference, how just framing the task of being in the world in this particular way has enabled us to do so much and answer so many questions. If you watch those videos by Clayton, you will actually see how powerful it is to have a principle like this. This is not my objective in this video to actually tell you everything I have seen and know, but this is it. So we could even talk about testing, we could talk about achievement, we could talk about inclusion, not only as accounting for a child, but accounting for the richness of the environment in teaching and in testing. And actually saying that exclusion means disabling in test and in learning access to the bigger world, right? So now, just to summarize here, what else we were talking about in class was how are schools approaching community relationships. This is because it very often comes up in your assignments and now has all of this relating to, for example, this kind of project. There's a particular research done by University of South Australia on reading, and I'm not going to go there. You can find it for yourselves if you need it. I think the person on whom I'm actually basing this particular graph, this is my graph. He actually produced the critique of the current system. I have actually produced a solution. So this is copyright Ania Lian, and I still have to publish it in other form than just on my podcasts. Now, as I said to you, children create the world on their own frames of reference, right? So if you now, we're talking now about school and community relationships. So this is just the principle. If children construct the world on or act in the world on their frames of reference if you enable children to explore their frames of references in relation to in many contexts, then you enable them to create a thing, and then so work together in order on a project, or in teams. They create something here, and then they send it out into that world from which the whole thing came. So you can see now, you take it out of the world and you send it into the world. Now, how is that about community relationships? Well, you can see now that children get from the community and give to the community. Because as in my classes, our master students point to the fact that there are breakfast programs, and there's a lot of programs run by schools where children receive, and that's very good. But what we need to do is to make it very conscious for children to actually learn that they are in school to learn about the rich world out there, so that their heads expand the frames of reference on which they act. So the school community relationships could be about students learning consciously that they take out of the community and then they give to the community. Now you think to yourselves maybe, well, how? And then there are projects like this. I'm sure schools do these things. But I often ask myself, wouldn't it be nice if children were allowed to create things, creative things? I'm not going to give you my examples. You can actually think for yourselves, or books, or God knows, things online and whatever, and take it to the hospital where other sick children are lying and would love a company, would love to play and be read to or be shown things. And so that children don't just produce a thing for the teacher, they just don't go through the series of exercises, but actually take their products to the community. All the people need to be read to. There are lots of lonely people. There are lots of happy people who would actually want to see children performing. So you can see there is a need in the community, and these school community relationships do not need to be only about parents being informed about children's progress, or parents doing things for the school or for the children. I have no problem with that, but what I'm asking you is to actually use the principle of children, or us being only able to act on our frames of reference. And as you work with it, you think to yourself, what does that mean? It means that children take from the world. Wouldn't it be nice to give to the world? Right? So you can actually now use this principle to ask yourself, have we exhausted all the strategies? Do we have these things in place? Wouldn't it be nice to have these things in place? So I will close here. This is something that I made a picture in the class. So it's not really, it's pretty much what I said here. So now what I wanted to do is just basically summarize. We have projects here in these units 508, 509, whatever the units numbers are. We've got projects on pretty much everything, right? So there are particular things that I have dealt with today, and wanted to leave you with this particular summary, of these issues, these bullet points: interaction, learned differences, obvious now, meaning versus structure. Structure is a description, meaning is actually the frames of reference on which we act. It's very much internal. It's taken out of the community, but it's internalized in relation to how we see the world. With scaffolding, now you need to a little bit think about it, isn't it? Because interaction or interactive learning condition and scaffolding may not be the same. Right, and here comes Bakhtin. Now, most of you probably never heard of Bakhtin. That is because for some inexplicable reason in the Western world, or in the Anglo-Saxon world, Vygotsky and Bakhtin were contemporaries. Both had different ways of looking actually at meaning management. And for some inexplicable reason, somehow people think that scaffolding, a kind of building children up to completion, it's kind of more commonsensical. Now, I am not against the term, but what I would like to invite you to start thinking about the concept a little bit more critically, and invite maybe Bakhtin, who talks about the dance of frames of reference. A dance. Frames of references are alive. Right? So I would like to refocus you away from, if you even a little bit held the idea that we could actually create a path for the student, which is not necessarily maybe how you thought about it, then I would like you to actually think about it a bit more critically and think about interactivity more than scaffolding. I kind of relate to it better. You might actually need to, when you talk about your own ways of looking at pedagogy, you might actually want to be precise. Now, you cannot teach anyone anything. Who says that? Neuroscientists say it nowadays. I mean, in the past, spiritualists used to say it. Now, neuroscientists say it. You cannot teach anyone anything. Children have to put it together in their own heads, which comes back to the interactivity. Um, right, the last point is from Clayton, and it's not relevant at this very moment. So I might leave you here now. This video is quite long, with all these slides and all these thoughts whose basic idea was to actually focus you on everything in this world as being about meaning management, and actually identify the concept of meaning, and then seeing how much actually power you get from the way you define the concept of meaning management in relation to everything that matters in education. And that includes all these concepts. I'm trying to find them now. Interaction, ICT, achievement, testing, community development, all of them. So thank you for now. I hope it was informative.